I really don't know how you respond when people accuse you of something. For someone like me, however, I can help you from uh, more than one vantage point. That is, from the view of an educator familiar with what a learning organization uh, would look like, and in which some have never found themselves in a learning organization where uh, our schemas, our mental models, our constructs, if you will, are challenged, where we are encouraged to review and revise, search and research. So when I, for example, found myself pastoring a New Testament church, according to the history, a 2,000-year history of the Lord's churches here, from the time of Christ. And yes, we teach and support that in churches. There's really no such thing as a church that doesn't support that. So the strangest things categories seem to be literally constructed as well. And these categories are the accusations people make. And it's actually from the word. Accuse is from the word categorize. So it's striking that I noticed there was a disconnect between a learning organization and even what a church might be, which is not necessarily a learning organization, which one would expect it to be, since it's about disciple making, and our churches have been entrusted the disciple making process that was initiated from the time of Christ as he walked on the earth. So, what is it when someone, for example, I've been accused of being a closed theist or an open theist? Well, now the accuser is not necessarily at the level of expertise of the accusation. That is, to rise to the level to make an accusation doesn't find yourself very high in the level or degree of difficulty to do that. Some people can just pick up things like birds collecting seeds from the ground and then just make accusations. So for me, accusations are, well, more often than not, they're just indicative of someone so anxious to accuse that they've never really engaged a highly disciplined learning process. For example, of the living theism which is taught in the Bible, just in English, if you use one of these, well, software is out there, but blueletterbible.org, it's available to anyone, user friendly. There's other programs out there, but this is just one that a person who doesn't even read Bible languages can just navigate it so easily. I know, because if I can use it, anyone can use that one. But if you were to just search living God, you'd find over 50 occurrences. Now, other phrases, living and true God, but unless you ever study those phrases and that attribute of living, and then take those contexts, let's say over 50 contexts, well, now what happens is that's cognitive overload. That is, let's say we populate a construct with over 50 elements that give us unique implications to why God of the Bible is known as the living God. Well, that would be a virtual book. Well, it's called the Bible. It's inside the Bible. But topical preaching and expository preaching doesn't necessarily populate a construct that's there in the Bible. That is, living theism is what the Bible teaches, but who's ever bothered with that? For example, Dr. William Lane Craig, a world-renowned theologian, philosopher, apologist, scholastic, spoke of how he taught or studied God's all-knowingness, God's omniscience, and studied for years and came to the conclusion that though God knows everything, it doesn't mean that what a person does or does not do is of necessity. And then you might hear even Baptist theologians who formulate their theology from the Bible, and they'll say, well, God might know everything, but it doesn't make his knowledge causal. That's from a causal stem in Biblical Hebrew. However, neither necessarily are adequate to express what, for example, like myself, if I took my hardback concordance, as we once used those in our old lexicons, hard copied, if you just went through and searched out all those occurrences according to a concordance and you placed them in their context and you noticed each unique implication that was there, God communicating, conveying that to us, well, you would then have led out from the scriptures, and from having done that, that would be called exegesis, and you would be exegetical, and you would be projecting and proclaiming and promoting and announcing rightly, and happy to do so, that is. As a Bible teacher, you would posit outwardly living theism. But eisegesis is the same. It shows and is self-evident even in apologetics, where it just seems people say, we'll never resolve all this. Well, no, not when something is from eisegesis, a product of eisegesis, where we take a category, which is itself constructed. You won't find the phrase open theism or closed theism in the Bible. So we import that into the Bible. We then support it with text to assure that what we're saying is the case. But then to withhold unintentionally, of course. Now, people don't mean to omit. Omissive errors are that about which the person who's committed the error of omission, they're completely incognizant of that. So we don't need to beat people up. It just seems that people are so anxious to be cruel, at times contentious in their contention for the faith. And it's a strange thing, because I can help you know that people are sometimes more anxious to accuse you of something rather than take that energy and search out the scriptures and, let's say, look up the words and some of the most basic parts of hermeneutics. So if you run across a practitioner of hermeneutics like myself, I don't really have a lot of energy to accuse somebody. I wouldn't know why I would want to. We do have a subject matter. We can have and acquire subject matter expertise. We do not need an eisegetical, that is, definition imported into the Bible, even like the accusations about free will that people are just so anxious to make. And they make it a binary reality. Are you, do you support it? Or are you against it? And it is never even mentioned. That is the antecedent to the pronoun. A definition in the Bible is never posited outwardly. No exegesis occurs, no exposition. So let the banter continue. Well, it's an economy, the Bible says, and it's practiced regrettably by unjust stewards who have made an economy out of people. And I suppose in their mind, their conscience has been seared, because somehow they must justify by saying, well, these people are willing, to engage each other in outrage toward the other. So let's just keep feeding the battle, I suppose. But now pastors aren't called to do that. So where I pastor, I don't try to find a way to incite us versus them. The body of Christ is not divided. We are a unified body, and we're admonished in the letters to our church, in one letter, to endeavor to keep the unity of the Spirit. We are taught, according to the Bible and church letter, that we are a unified body. So, with those realities being the case of a New Testament church, it certainly a little bit surprised me as a pastor when I began to make these videos, first and foremost for Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, which faithfully and fully gathers at 2200 Marshall Road, Jacksonville, Arkansas. Other people began to give feedback, which was fine. It's just then some presumed to take issue, and then so in the presence of the church, I was able to respond and give example and say, no, look, here's an accusation. First, it's a category. The term doesn't even exist in the Bible. And it's populated, it's proof text, if you will, proof texted. It's not the work of leading out from the scriptures, because if one were to start in the scriptures and then lead out. But again, let's go back to, for example, my expertise in teaching and learning and the realities of those activities. Cognitive overload, that's really between the ears of the student. Jesus said, as you meter, it be metered unto you, and we often only limit that to the way you measure something. But it also is, Jesus was never found overloading his students. It doesn't mean that some of his teachings weren't more than they could process. It just means he was a gracious teacher to meter them according to as they could receive it. And that's why cognitive overload. But think about today in our data world of data. It's called data overload. People can't process all the data. So just to think of over 50 occurrences of a phrase, living God, and to know that very few people even know anyone who've ever contextualized those phrases and then drawn the conclusions according to the implications communicated according to those contexts. Living theism isn't comparable. That would make closed and open just sub-theisms, and they're products of eisegesis, importing an artificially constructed category between the ears of men. And so we don't need to, or as pastor of a church, I assure people who are following Christ and are endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit, and we're laboring there together, co-laborers in Christ, working together to advance his kingdom and to realize the importance of the inbreaking of that self-disclosed expression of that monarchical reign of God through the person Jesus the Christ, who is that inbreaking. We seek to preach him, proclaim him, announce him correctly, send the good word out to everyone, and then engage that process of disciple making. And when a person believes that gospel, they're fathered through it. We then baptize them as a church. We baptize them into that church, into Christ. That is the assembly. And that's even grammatically expressed in the church letters as well. And then we enjoin them to commune into the gospel, fellowship into that gospel. We're careful to demarcate birth, genao, from save, sozo, and teach them the difference between a child and one who matures and develops to the son place, and worthy to be entrusted, grows upwardly to the full measure of that stature of Christ, according to the child training process that's in the Lord's New Testament church. And we should be a learning organization, but we're actually more than that. We're a learning organism. We're a living body. And in there, we're constantly searching the scriptures and researching those and bringing people along in a learner's yoke as Christ teaches them according to his burden that is light, that's good for us, and good for that individual student as well, and then that yoke, which is easy, it's doable. So it's not really doable to start with an accusation, which is not apologetics. I think it should be renamed. Most people don't have an apologetic ministry, they just have a categorical ministry where they categorize, accuse. So they lead off with these accusations, and people exasperate themselves. But don't allow yourself, don't kid yourself, don't fool yourself, don't lead yourself astray to try to argue against something. Someone asked me how I would disprove Calvinism. I said, well, when I hear of someone that's ever proven it, that's to test it and found someone faithful with what they're promoting, to evaluate it, that is diakrino, thoroughly judge it, and then to diagnose it, that's diagnosis, thoroughly know it, and then identify the elements. Then I will listen to them as they define, document, and disclose the fallible elements of it, and then I will gain the knowledge from that evaluation. But I wouldn't know how to engage someone who hasn't the character to even evaluate what they recommend others to believe. So as a pastor, it's a joy to actually be in an environment that's free to learn. And we have people who are learning doctrine, and their practice of that is always, there's always a knowledge gap. And we're bridging that, and not being a denomination, not being of the theistic traditions of this world, not being of state-established religion, not being of Catholic, Protestant, Judaic, Islamic, occultic, or New Age, or even of the denominated doctrines of the denominationalism. We're a New Testament church, unbroken history for 2,000 years. We're free and encouraged to liberate to study. So how you respond to an accusation probably is something you may not have thought about, is that when accused, just know your accuser. The anatomy of an accuser is typically ignorance and a lack of integrity. I say ignorance because they ignore fallible elements in that which they seek to impose upon you. And then a lack of integrity is it's not indicative of a high level of integrity to accuse someone for not supporting your fallible construct as though somehow it's an indictment, and yet not having even demonstrated that you've evaluated yourself. I mean, my first question to anyone who tells me they're a Calvinist or an Arminian or a Catholic or a Protestant or a Judaic or a charismatic, whatever these people assert themselves to be, is show me any text you have. I'm happy to, and then I can share that with someone else. It's just, unless you have a knowledge of the scriptures, it would never occur to you, nor does it often occur to people who don't study. It doesn't just, just some time and chance just happens where it occurred to you living theism. No, if you've never actually studied the scriptures, then what will not come to your mind are those scriptures. So, but when someone says something, let's say to me, for example, I don't experience disorientation by cognitive overload. I'm not injured and emotionally affected by it in my affective side, in my emotions and psyche, and I'm not, reeling from the data overload. Those are realities that my accusers, for example, mine personally, aren't even aware that I'm aware of. So this doesn't come to their mind very often. People who accuse, it doesn't occur to them they might be speaking to someone that knows what they're talking about. And that's the best thing to do, is always be ready to give a rationale, even if, like I do, and will be glad to do it. I'll help Calvinists, I'll help charismatics, I'll help people who identify themselves as Arminian, I'll help people that are Molinist, traditionalist, whatever you are. So to help you out, it's just better that people know what we're dealing with. And as a pastor, I could tell you, people that have energy to accuse did not invest that energy in studying the scriptures. So be prepared to realize they don't know what they're talking about. And for their sakes, which I've learned, it's a very great disappointment when they learn that, for example, I know what they're talking about and they don't even know that. So let's be patient, let's be gentle, as fruit of the Spirit affords us that great privilege to demarcate Christ and His message and His words and His good news according to a correlative demeanor and deportment. So you have a blessed day, but it'll help you understand yourself better. Why are you anxious or angered or maybe ashamed if you're accused of something? Well, it could be you're not quite informed in the subject matter, and you might not realize that person making the accusation is certainly more likely to not be aware of that which they're asserting. So you have a blessed day, and enjoy this lesson.